So our next guest today is Erika Myers. Welcome today, Erika. It's just wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's good to see you again. Now, we have a question here for you. You've said that electrification is the opportunity of the century for utilities. What are the ways that you've seen utilities in cities position themselves to take best advantage of this coming market growth? Now, before I get to your answer, I just want to make sure for the audience out there to make sure that you're asking questions for Erika. She's very much an expert here, so I'd please send them in to us. So thank you, Erika.
Well, thank you so much, James, and I'm really pleased to be part of the World EV Day. I think this is such an exciting opportunity for all of us to share the love that we mutually feel for electric technology. I personally, this last weekend, took the plunge. I sold my second gas car, and now we only drive all electric. And I'm really excited about that. It's been something 3 years in the making. And, it took a lot of time to convince my spouse that this was a good thing, but we eventually got there. And so, I see this as the most exciting period in transportation, and the next decade is going to be really remarkable. Utilities we see as emerging industry leaders, and in 3 ways we think that they play a very pivotal role in the future of transportation electrification. First, as a trusted energy advisor. Second, they have to think about being the future fuel providers, so making sure that the grid is ready for all of these new vehicles. And then third, we see them as a co-investor in the future of EV charging infrastructure. So drilling in a little bit more into these 3 points. First, as it relates to the trusted energy advisor, a lot of people typically go first to their utility if they're going to be doing anything related to electricity, right? So making sure that their customers have the information and the tools that they need to make smart purchasing decisions. So we see within cities, utilities taking on that role of guidance for transit agencies, government fleets, as they're converting their fleets over, educating them on everything from rates, demand charges, specifically, for example, time of use rates, how much it's going to cost to interconnect that new charging load, how that will impact their bills ultimately. Second, we see utilities providing advice for large corporations on things like workplace charging and sustainable energy, also for multi-unit dwellings or other large complexes of that nature, making sure that they understand what that impact will be for them and where they can potentially site the chargers to minimize the cost for integration. Third, we also see utilities incentivizing individuals through either direct rebates for things like chargers or even the vehicles, and providing that kind of additional catapult to make them, see the opportunity and switch. As it relates to grid readiness, we see, similar to what we've seen now with the oil industry, you got to make sure that the fuel is there, it's reliable, it's affordable, and in the case of electricity, that it is clean energy. And there are huge opportunities in terms of the load growth. The projections showed that by 2030, here in the United States, we'll see roughly 11% annual increase in electricity consumption. But it's really critical that we take into account distribution and transmission planning to make sure we have access to that energy, especially in cities which are typically urban and the infrastructure is underground. It's going to be more expensive to upgrade those systems. So we are preparing well in advance. So making sure the forecasts are correct, and that's going to rely a lot on lots of different people participating and providing that information to utilities to make sure they have that access. And then second, we're going to need to figure out a way to minimize on-peak charging. For those who aren't familiar with the term peak load, that's essentially roughly 100 hours a day when everybody has all their electricity devices turned on, and that's what we typically make our grid system prepared for. So we are preparing the grid for those 100 hours a year. We want to make sure that people aren't charging during those 100 hours a year. So giving them incentives to shift their charging load to off-peak times, let's say mostly at night, or maybe during the day when we're starting to see more and more solar hitting the system. So giving some incentivization and guidance to consumers about those charging opportunities. As it relates to the third piece on co-investment, the Brattle Group recently published a report in June that showed here in the US by 2030, we're going to need somewhere between $75 to $125 billion of investment to accommodate 20 million EVs by 2030. That's a huge amount of investment. We see utilities as coming to the table and providing some of that funding. So far, utility investments that have been approved by regulators are equivalent to about $750 million. So that infrastructure can be made available today for communities and cities for things like multi-unit dwellings and public charging infrastructure, workplace charging. There are more proposals out there that are being considered, but we do see that utilities will play a major role in helping the industry get the infrastructure that we absolutely need to give people the confidence to make the switch to electric, that they won't get stranded and that they have access to reliable and affordable power.
So thank you very much, Erika. We do have some questions. The first one today is from Audrey Wang at Gosselin. How do we make passenger EVs more accessible, or should we be focusing on the transforming the paradigm for people moving among cities, increasing public transportation accessibility? Obviously there's this dilemma going on, or, what is the future, and I know your work has been with electric vehicles, but, also in needing to encourage transit as well. What are your thoughts?
SEPA has called our focus on this pathway transportation electrification for a reason. We see it's not just light duty, it's medium and heavy duty, on-road and off-road. We also see opportunities with marine, so boats, and also air. So how can we eventually switch our planes to run on electric? And SEPA's vision is that we will have completely decarbonized our transportation sector by 2050. So in the next 30 years, everything needs to shift to cleaner forms of fuel, not just in light-duty passenger vehicles. So I completely concur that this is not something that happens one at a time. It all needs to happen in parallel, which from a utility perspective makes things a lot more complicated. But also for me and for many others in the industry, it's very exciting.
Absolutely, and it's very exciting for me too. Question from Patrick McGuinness here. Some monopoly utilities, particularly in the South, actively fight against distributed electric generation. How can this be worked through and reversed? Obviously there's politics involved here. Obviously there's other behind the scenes things, but, encouraging electric vehicles and encouraging utilities to work through this. What have you been seeing?
So, as it relates to conflicts locally, I have a very strong feeling a lot of these conflicts come from fear. The fear that I won't have a job in 5 years or 10 years in my industry. And so where I think we need to spend more time focused on as an industry more broadly is the opportunities to transition people who are working in a fossil industry into an electric vehicle industry. And we absolutely think that there are parallels between the different job types and making sure that we have a just transition for those fossil fuel workers and give them the job training opportunities to move into these new market segments. So I think the fear of it is something that's there and certainly present, and that we all need to work together in this transition and become change agents, as well as supporting our fellow Americans in this transition. And as it relates to utilities, and the role of utilities and the broader industry, I think first and foremost, education and information is something we all need to take seriously, making sure that the information is transparent, it's publicly available, it's accessible for everyone, and that it's translated in a way that's not industry jargon, but that most people can understand.
Thank you again, Erika. Really appreciate you having us, you coming along to our panel for World EV Day today. So we've got some questions for everyone between each other of the panelists. So this question is from Asaf to Erika, and it's surrounding the impact of COVID on electric utility investment in transportation. Asaf, can you ask this question to Erika, please?
Sure, Erika, I was wondering if you've seen any impact at all from COVID on utility investment in transportation electrification.
Yeah, so I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of utilities in the past couple of months, and the trend shows that there was a slowdown in utility program uptake and enrollment for the first part of the spring into the summer. But fortunately, most of those programs are continuing to move forward and making progress. With the exception of workplace charging, I don't think that's a surprise for anyone here on the phone. The workplace charging programs have definitely had an impact. And then similarly, any programs that involve the utility coming out specifically and installing infrastructure, those programs have had an impact also, because I think of concerns about, proximity to contractors and things like that. We have seen, though, that public infrastructure, that we saw a slowdown in charging, that has picked up through the summer. So fortunately, some of those public charging investments are being utilized at a higher rate again. So I'd say things are moving ahead. Utilities are still putting together their regulatory filings and working with their boards to get investments approved. That has not slowed. So I'm feeling very optimistic.
Thank you, Erika. Much appreciated. We've got Sarah. I know you've got another question for Erika here. How can EVs be used as grid assets during power shutoffs? So I think I just asked your question, so sorry, Sarah, but so tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think that all of us are thinking about how can we take advantage of this like 60 kilowatt battery that's sitting in my car right now during all these shutoffs that we're hearing about in California and elsewhere, as it relates to recent weather conditions. And I think that's a big, really important question. I've worked on vehicle grid integration topics as kind of my main area of focus for the last 3 years. And it's something that I feel really personally passionate about. I think that everyone who cares about EVs should also care about EV load management. That's how I see the world. I think we want to have this new technology, but we want it without any of the consequences, right? We don't want more fossil fuel plants built as a result of new EVs. And so we think of rates and managed charging, which is the unidirectional signals to delay charge or start charge depending on the amount of clean energy in the system, as the first steps to enabling what we think is a really robust future for EV charging more broadly. But I think added on to that, how can we take advantage of this battery storage, which, believe it or not, there's more storage in the Nissan Leaf population here in the United States than there is collectively across all of the stationary battery storage units in the US. There's more power storage in those Nissan Leafs. So if we could leverage those Nissan Leafs, which today are bidirectionally capable through the CHAdeMO, if we could leverage those in some sort of really unique way for utility programs or for wholesale power markets, what could that do for increasing the robustness and reliability of our grid? And the problem is that we haven't really figured out a way to access those chargers. We don't have interconnection policies. We don't have export tariffs. The net energy metering rules and regulations aren't going to be enough of an incentive to get somebody to export power into the grid. So there's a lot of things that we need to do between now and then. But it's an exciting time. Like I keep saying over and over again, I mean, I love problems. You love problems, James. We can find problems and solutions together.
Yeah, that's it, Erika. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Now, one thing, I'm going to put you all on the spot. I want each of you to give like a very brief 1 second, a few words or one sentence summary of what you think, the future of the cities is with electric vehicles. Erika, what's your thoughts? Just really briefly to wrap up.
So I see the future of EVs as evolving alongside autonomous vehicles. So we can deploy electric vehicles to service, let's say, constrained feeders or other places in emergency situations. That would be a way that we can continue to leverage these transportation investments, as well as make society at large better and a more wonderful place to live. As we see more and more people moving towards car sharing and then out of their own personal vehicles.